Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into a super simple topic: sleep, or more precisely, how medieval folks caught their Z's. Spoiler alert, it's way weirder than you'd think. So before you get too cozy, take a sec to smash that like button and subscribe only if you actually dig what I'm cooking here. Oh, and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Always fun to see who's pulling an all-nighter with us around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing white noise. Let's embark on tonight's sleepy adventure. Before electricity, TikTok, and all that sleep hygiene nonsense, medieval people followed a sleep schedule that would confuse even the biggest melatonin junkies today. It's called segmented sleep, a natural two-part cycle, neatly sliced like an old medieval cookie. The routine's simple. After sunset, most folks hit the hay early and fall into the first sleep. Then, about 4 hours later, they deliberately wake up and spend an hour or two doing what you might call multitasking in the dead of night. Medieval style, this wasn't seen as insomnia. Nope. That's just how sleep worked back then. The vigil between the two sleeps was practical, useful, and sometimes shockingly social. People used that time to pray, read religious texts, watch the fire, or check on their livestock, because nothing wrecks your ram's night like wondering if your goat is still in the yard. And yes, believe it or not, this was prime time for intimacy. Medieval docs and marriage guides pointed out that the body was rested and the mind calm then, which is probably just a polite way to say too tired to argue. So if you ever thought you were romantic, waking up early to make coffee for your sweetheart, just know your ancestors were playing in a whole different league. The second sleep would roll in after this period and last until sunrise. Everyone from monks to peasants followed this nocturnal rhythm. Even writers like Chaucer casually mentioned it. So yeah, medieval literature talks about not sleeping the right way, weirdly enough. Modern science now thinks segmented sleep might actually be more natural for humans. These two sleep cycles synced with our circadian rhythms before artificial light existed. So next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a, don't freak out, I'll just whisper, "Ah yes, the night watch has begun," and go tend to that iconic fireplace. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, with factories, gas lamps, and a growing obsession with productivity, that people started buying into the 8-hour uninterrupted sleep myth. Like sleep was some kind of timed sport. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night was not a fail, it was the schedule, and everyone had to play along whether they liked it or not. Now, let's talk beds, or more accurately, medieval bed simulations. Today, we're obsessed with thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether the mattress feels like a cloud. In medieval Europe, beds were usually just a pile of once living stuff, now flattened under the weight of bad sleep and unspoken regrets. A typical peasant bed was a straw mattress called a pallet, literally just straw or dry grass stuffed into a rough sack if they could afford one. If not, it was just straw on the floor, maybe damp, or maybe nibbled on by the cat. These pallets weren't comfy, but hey, better than nothing, which was the only other option. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and pretty good at insulation. It was also a 5-star hotel for bugs, lice, and occasionally field mice, making sleep and exercise a quiet affair. If it itched, you just ignored it. If it bit, you shifted a bit and hoped for the best. Everyone had to follow the rules, whether they liked it or not. Let's talk about beds, or more accurately, medieval bed wannabes. Today, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether the mattress feels like sleeping on a cloud. Back in medieval Europe, beds were mostly just a pile of dead stuff, squished flat under the weight of bad sleep and unspoken regrets. The typical peasant's bed was a straw mattress called a pallet, literally straw or dried grass, stuffed into a rough sack, if they could even afford a sack. Otherwise, it was just straw on the floor. Maybe damp straw, maybe half eaten by the cat. These pallets weren't exactly comfy, but hey, better than nothing. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and pretty good at insulation. It was also a five-star hotel for bugs, lice, and the occasional field mouse, making sleeping and exercising patience equally challenging. If it itched, you just ignored it. If it bit, you shifted a bit and hoped for the best. Wealthier families, or at least those with strong backs, could lift the straw mattress onto a wooden frame. Not a game changer for comfort, but it helped a little. Sometimes you'd wake up with a beetle in your ear. Linen sheets were a luxury. Most people wore the same clothes all day, even to bed. Real pajamas. Forget about it. Privacy. Also a myth. The whole family, kids, parents, maybe even the elders crammed into the same space, sometimes on the same pile of straw. The whole family, kids, parents, maybe even the elders crammed into the same space, sometimes on the same pile of straw. If you got too hot, you just rolled into your cousin's elbow. If you got too hot, you just rolled into your cousin's elbow. Of course, the nobles had proper beds, big wooden frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and canopies to block drafts and hopefully bugs. These beds were so valuable. They were passed down as heirlooms. You didn't inherit land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. But for most medieval folk, beds weren't about comfort. They were about not freezing, avoiding the chickens, and maybe dreaming of someday sleeping somewhere that didn't creak or rustle. Today, when we think of a bedtime drink, we picture something warm, maybe whiskey, a cozy fire, and a questionable life choice. But in medieval times, a bedtime drink wasn't a drink at all. It was a hat, a real physical piece of cloth, often looking ridiculous, designed to keep your head warm while you slept. You see, insulation wasn't exactly the medieval building's strong suit. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made from thin animal horn or oil-treated parchment did little to block the cold. And central heating, that was just the family dog, so keeping kids' heads warm at night was crucial, especially since body heat escapes fastest through the scalp. Medieval folks used simple nightcaps. These hats came in all shapes and sizes, but the iconic version was long and pointy, like the hairstyle of a chimney-sweeping witch. They were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever leftover heat source wouldn't piss off the family goat. For men, a practical accessory. For women, sometimes it doubled as a shawl or headscarf, both modesty and a cover-up for hair unwashed since last Lent. But beyond warmth, nightcaps had social value. In some places, married women had to keep their heads covered, yes, even while sleeping, and the hats themselves might be embroidered or dyed to show off family wealth or status, because nothing screams success like going to bed with a tiny flag on your head. In more urban spots, nightcaps even symbolized I'm off duty. If you opened your door wearing one of these, it was the polite medieval way of saying, nope, not dressed to chat, and, yep, that hat meant buzz off. Of course. Nightcaps usually came with nightgowns. The hat itself could be embroidered or dyed to show off the family's wealth or status, because nothing screams success like going to bed with a little flag planted on your head. In the city, sleeping caps were basically the badge of I'm off duty. If you opened your door wearing one of these, it was the polite medieval way of saying, I'm not dressed for chit chat. And, yep, that hat basically translated to buzz off. Of course, sleeping caps usually came with nightgowns, basically long, baggy robes. Think Ebenezer Scrooge, minus the soul-crushing moral lessons. Nightwear wasn't sexy, but it was practical, itchy, and occasionally flammable. Nowadays, sleeping next to a stranger is mostly limited to overnight flights, ambitious camping trips, or bizarre Airbnb mix-ups. But in medieval Europe, this was just normal, not optional. Imagine you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just a guy who gave up halfway while hauling a mule to Norwich. You find an inn, a rare luxury, and ask for a spot to crash. What you get is a bed that's already got someone sleeping on it. Medieval inns worked exactly like that. More like human dorms than cozy hotels. Privacy, forget about it. If the bed's empty, you're sharing usually with total strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, or sports some suspicious boils. And no, this wasn't rude. It was just efficient resource management. One bed could fit 2, 3, even 4 guests, depending on size and how chill society was that day. In big cities, you'd end up in a dorm with row after row of beds and zero privacy. Snore wars were real, and no one kept score. Elbow territory was fiercely defended. Sometimes men and women got separated, but not always. Some hospitals even tried grouping beds by profession: blacksmiths with blacksmiths, priests with priests, thieves with other thieves. But mostly, first come, first served sounds like a germaphobe's worst nightmare. But back then, it beat sleeping outside with wolves, rain, and the occasional peasant uprising. Modern germaphobes would freak out. But it was an upgrade over being outside with wolves, rain, and those random peasant riots. Worried about thieves, lots of travelers tied their bags to their belts or hid them under their clothes. Some even slept on their luggage, turning it into both pillow and alarm system. If someone moved your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up broke. Of course, the rich didn't have to deal with this. Nobles traveled with entourages and camped in relative comfort, or demanded private rooms if the innkeeper cared about their roof. In medieval times, going to bed wasn't just pulling up the covers and conking out. It was a spiritual event, a nightly gamble where your eternal soul was the bet. People didn't just sleep, they steeled themselves for the possibility of death. That's why bedtime prayers became a thing. Forget lavender spray or soothing podcasts. Medieval sleepers often ended the night with confessions, hymns, and soul-cleansing spells, just in case they kicked the bucket between midnight and dawn. The idea was simple. You could die anytime from illness, fire, demons, or the scariest dying after 30 in the year 1247. So, better pray, not because it comforted you, but because hell was terrifying. And you didn't want to show up uninvited, dirty and soul messed up. A popular prayer went, "If I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Sweet, right." Except it's basically a legal disclaimer written by a 7-year-old, admitting death could happen before you even get to sleep. Many adults had whole prayer catalogs for every threat imaginable, one for guilt trips, one for when you thought demons were lurking on the beams, another for the plague, though that one was a bit outdated. Some even prayed to specific saints known for watching over sleepers, like holy bouncers guarding your soul at the club entrance. Monks, nuns, and seriously devout nobles ended their days with a final prayer ritual before bed. After Compline, they swore silence, which wasn't hard since everyone was exhausted, hungry, and kinda scared of the dark. Not because it comforts you, but because hell is terrifying, and you really don't want to show up uninvited. Unwashed, and with a messy soul, a popular version went, "If I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Sweet, right, except it's basically a 7-year-old's legal disclaimer, admitting death before dawn is a real option. Plenty of adults had whole playlists of prayers for every kind of threat. One for guilt trips, one for when you suspect demons lurking on the rafters, one for plague protection, though that one's pretty outdated. Some even prayed to specific saints known for watching over sleepers, like holy bodyguards guarding your soul at the club entrance. The truly devout monks, nuns, and nobles ended their day with final prayers before lights out. After Compline, they swore to keep silent, which wasn't hard since everyone was dead tired, starving, and a little scared of the dark. Kids were encouraged to pray too, partly because it was good for their souls, partly because it gave them something to do other than ask why the dog was on their bed. Parents reminded them angels were watching, which sounds cute until you realize it's not guardian angels, but the original heavenly surveillance system. Basically, bedtime prayer wasn't about peace, it was last-minute damage control. Think medieval antivirus software. You hope it works, even if you're not. In the modern world, dreams are usually just nonsense stress, too much cheese, or your brain sorting paperwork in the dark. But back in the Middle Ages, dreams were serious business because they had eternal consequences. Dreams weren't just dreams. People saw them as messages from God, saints, demons, your guardian angel, or maybe that weird relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations, others were devilish temptations. Either way, you had to pay attention and maybe write it down, confess, or fast for 3 days to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent ages decoding dreams. Entire texts were devoted to this. Dreaming of fire, probably hell knocking on your door. Water could mean purification or drowning. A man with a goat head juggling fish. Call a priest ASAP and seriously consider moving. Medieval folks believed your soul was still active while you slept. That means your dream actions could spill your hidden sins or mental weak spots. Embarrassed about dreaming you stole a loaf of bread, maybe your subconscious is confessing your real-life gluttony or just plain hunger. Either way, better to confess just in case. Monks and nuns often wrote down their dreams and shared them with their spiritual superiors. Some were praised for having holy visions in their sleep. Others were told to cut back on onions before bedtime. Of course, dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles they made for killer plot twists. Medieval literature is packed with knights meeting angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures waxing poetic about virtue. Dreams were basically medieval Netflix, more metaphors, fewer happy endings. Unsurprisingly, the church was suspicious. Not every dream was sacred. Some were believed to be devilish tricks to corrupt innocent souls. If you dreamed something nasty, it meant your soul was under attack or you were sleeping too close to the fireplace smoke. Nowadays, some people let their pets sleep in bed. Cozy, sure, but sometimes smelly. Back then, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a quirky personal choice, it was a heating strategy. Let's start with the basics. Medieval houses weren't exactly designed for comfort. Stone walls, zero insulation, and wind so fierce it probably had its own name. Central heating was called the pig family in peasant homes. Humans and livestock often shared a room, sometimes even the same bed, usually piled on the same straw heap. Chickens wandered freely, dogs curled up at your feet, pigs sniffed quietly by the hearth, and if you were lucky, none of them bit you at night. It wasn't about affection, though medieval folks definitely loved their animals. It was about survival. Animals generate body heat. They're warm, reliable, and unlike some relatives, don't hog the blankets. A big dog could keep your toes from freezing. A cow in the corner might raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in January was basically a miracle. Medieval houses, especially poor ones, often had just one room for everything cooking, eating, sleeping, sometimes even dying. People and animals shared the same space. Kids might sleep between parents and a goat. A chicken could serve as an impromptu alarm clock. Hygiene. Let's not dig too deep. For wealthy families, this was less common. Nobles usually didn't sleep next to livestock, though they might keep dogs in bed, implying your soul is under attack or you just accidentally fell asleep too close to the fireplace smoke. Today, some people let their pets sleep in bed. Cozy setup, even if sometimes a bit stinky. But back in medieval times, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a quirky personal choice. It was a heating strategy. Let's start with basics. Medieval homes weren't exactly built for comfort. Stone walls, zero insulation, winds so fierce they probably had names. Central heating was called the pig family. In peasant homes, humans and livestock often shared a room, sometimes the same bed, usually piled onto the same straw heap. Free-range chickens roaming, dogs curled at your feet, pigs snuffling near the hearth, and if you were lucky, none of them bit you at night. It wasn't about affection, although medieval folks definitely loved their animals. It was survival. Animals generate body heat. They're warm, reliable, and unlike some human relatives, they don't hog the blankets. A big dog could save your toes from frostbite. Cow in the corner could raise the room temperature a degree or two, which in January felt like magic. Medieval houses, especially for the lower class, usually had one room for everything cooking, eating, sleeping, sometimes even dying. People and animals shared the space. Kids might sleep between parents and a goat. A chicken could serve as a makeshift alarm clock. Magic. Medieval houses, especially the poor folks' ones, usually had just one room for everything cooking, eating, sleeping, and sometimes dying. Yeah, everyone, people, and animals crammed into the same space. Kids could be sandwiched between mom and dad and a goat. A chicken might double as an impromptu alarm clock. Hygiene. Let's not ask too many questions. For the rich, this wasn't the norm. Nobles usually didn't sleep with livestock, though they might keep dogs on the bed, not for warmth, but for style and redistributing goods. Some castles even had special bedrooms for pets, because nothing screams power like a dog with its own room and title. Of course, there were downsides. Animals could be noisy, they could wander off, and historically speaking, they weren't exactly known for respecting personal space. It was the medieval folks who had to adapt. A kick in the face at 3 a.m. was just part of the bedtime routine. If you've ever had to share a room at a youth hostel and thought, this is a bit much, let me introduce you to the medieval monastery dorm, where comfort went to die under a vow of silence. Monks really didn't buy into privacy, kindness, or fun. A typical dorm housed dozens of monks, all crammed into one big room, lined up like sardines. Beds, if you want to call them that, were usually just wooden planks, sometimes with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling generous or it was a holiday. You slept fully clothed not for modesty, but because putting on clothes in the dark at 2 a.m. to pray was more painful than just staying dressed. The monastery uniform robes, belts, sandals served as spiritual armor and lousy insulation. If you were cold, you layered up. If you were hot, tough luck. No pillows, no curtains for privacy, and absolutely no talking. Silence was enforced, not suggested. Under Saint Benedict's rule, if you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you might be sentenced to a week of bathroom duty. Still, snoring was a gray area. You can't control it, but if it caused a ruckus, God might hold you accountable, or at least your bunkmate would. Lights were minimal, maybe just a candle. You didn't need to see anything. You just had to lie still and not sin. That was the goal, despite the misery. Monks believed their Spartan beds were training grounds for the afterlife, preparing their souls by denying every earthly luxury. Sleep wasn't a pleasure. It was a scheduled necessity like everything else. Some monks even slept, sitting up to avoid any hint of luxury. Dreaming or circulation compared to that. A farmer's pile of straw and some snoring pigs seemed downright fancy. At least the pigs didn't judge you. Now let's talk about something that would terrify most modern sleepers, voluntarily waking up at 2 a.m., not for the bathroom or prayer reading, but actual praying. Loud, cold, candlelit prayer in medieval monasteries. This was standard practice. Monks and nuns followed a strict daily schedule based on canonical hours, including matins, the first ceremony of the day, and by day, we mean the darkest time of night, when even owls are debating whether to get up. The bell would ring, usually struck by a chosen monk, and all the sleep-deprived robed souls would silently shuffle to the chapel. Yes, still fully dressed, because monks don't do pajamas. The only hierarchy they trusted was spiritual, inside the chapel, under flickering candles and echoing stone arches. They'd sing hymns, recite scripture, and desperately try not to nod off, standing up, which was actually a real problem. There are records of monks getting punished for dozing off during prayer, usually by extra chores or more prayers, if you nodded off on the mat. Congrats, you'd be leading the next round. Matins could last an hour or more. Some, especially zealous orders, stretched it to 2. Imagine trying to stay spiritually connected while your stomach reminds you dinner was lentil soup and a moral lesson, and your body's actively shutting down. After the service, monks would either go back to bed for round 2 or, under stricter orders, jump straight into study or manual labor, because nothing screams holy discipline like pounding wheat for 4 hours. Your stomach reminds you that dinner's just a bowl of lentils and a moral lesson, while your body's busy shutting down after the ceremony. Monks would head back to bed for round two, or, if they were feeling extra disciplined, dive straight into studying or manual labor, because nothing says sacred discipline like threshing wheat for 4 hours of fragmented rest. Why so early? The idea was to sacrifice comfort and give the first, quietest part of the night to God without distractions from daylight, warmth, or sleep cycles, a powerful symbol of devotion, or at least, after you get past the numbness in your limbs, candle smoke, and the off-key chanting of Brother Ambrose. In modern times, sleeping alone is often seen as a luxury, a sign of independence, peace, or just plain control over the blanket. But back in the medieval days, sleeping solo was suspicious, impractical, or just plain unsafe. Let's start with the basics: warmth. Beds weren't exactly cozy. Stone walls and open chimneys didn't trap heat well, and central heating was still a hot mess. So people shared beds to keep warm, not for cuddles, but basic survival. Kids slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes neighborhood kids if they were visiting, like a sleepover. But nobody asked if you wanted to join. But beyond warmth, there was a spiritual reason for group sleeping. Many believed night was when demons were extra active. Being alone in the dark left your soul vulnerable to temptation or worse, possession. Having someone nearby created a moral buffer. If something weird happened, at least someone else was there to witness or catch the demon first. For kids, being alone at night was nearly unthinkable, not just for comfort, but because demons, fairies, and wandering spirits were all part of the night scene. Stories warned that sleeping alone led to disaster and spiritual danger, and unlike today's bedtime stories, these didn't end with hugs. Nope. They ended with people vanishing. Even married couples often shared beds with kids, servants, or random strangers. Privacy? That was just a modern myth. Actually, the idea of two people sleeping separately in a giant bed was so weird, it was seen as either wasteful or downright shady in religious circles. Even monks usually bunked together, and if someone got assigned to sleep alone, that was punishment. Yep. In some medieval cases, sleeping solo was a legit penalty. The medieval logic, sleeping alone invites sin. Group sleep meant public accountability. So next time you curl up on your bed with a blanket that doesn't smell like a goat, enjoy the silence. Back then, you probably had 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin all snoring in there with you. If you ever accidentally nodded off in class, on a carriage, or at the dentist's office, you might wake up with a stiff neck and some serious regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping flat on your back wasn't a coincidence. It was a lifestyle. Some medieval folks, especially the rich or the devout, preferred to sleep propped up instead of lying flat. Why? A few reasons, none of which sound very cozy. First, there was a medical belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, lungs, and the overall balance of bodily fluids. In a world where doctors thought a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this made perfect sense. They figured sleeping upright helped avoid brain congestion, which sounds scary but really meant don't drown in your own sleep. Secondly, spiritual worries came into play. Lying flat was way too close to corpse position. You didn't want to confuse God, or worse, catch the Grim Reaper's eye by sleeping like you were at a funeral. Superstitious? Absolutely. But when your local priest doubles as the Community health advisor. You pick your battles carefully. The result? People usually slept on their side, supported by big pillows, cushions, or wooden headboards that were basically medieval recliners. Nobles sometimes propped their beds up with rigid corner supports to keep a sitting posture, perfect for digesting that meaty evening pie or fending off surprise demon attacks. Monks took it a step further, under strict rules. They might even sleep sitting upright on benches or lean against cold walls with nothing but a hood to hide their discomfort. It wasn't about health, it was about discipline. If you got too comfy, you might dream. If you dream, you might sin. If you sin, get ready to confess at 5 Needless to say, this wasn't about sleep quality. It was about virtue, discomfort, and some pretty confusing theology. Forget haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval people, the real monsters of the night hid in the sheets, tiny, relentless, and utterly indifferent to your prayers. Of course, we're talking about fleas, lice, and the unofficial mascot of medieval bedrooms, bedbugs. No sugarcoating here. Hygiene wasn't exactly Europe's strong suit back then. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive, and soap was sometimes made from stuff you definitely don't want to know about. Add straw mattresses, shared bedding, and occasionally live chickens underfoot, and you get the perfect bug buffet. Fleas and lice were so common, they were basically roommates. Farmers dealt with them daily, the nobles. Despite hooded hats to hide discomfort, it wasn't about health, it was about discipline. If you got too comfortable, you might dream. If you dream, you might sin. If you sin, confess at 5 sharp. Needless to say, this wasn't about good sleep quality. It was about virtue, discomfort, and some seriously confusing theology. Forget haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval folks, the real night monsters hid in the sheets, tiny, relentless, and utterly indifferent to your prayers. Of course, we're talking fleas, lice, and the unofficial mascot of the medieval bedroom bedbugs. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't exactly Europe's strong suit in the Middle Ages. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive, and soap was sometimes made from mysterious ingredients. Add straw mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken underfoot, and you've got the perfect setting for an all-you-can-eat insect buffet. Fleas and lice were so common, they were basically roommates. Farmers dealt with them daily. Nobles. Despite satin sheets and feather beds weren't exempt. In fact, some wealthier households even had people whose job was to nitpick literally. Servants tasked with removing lice from their master's hair and clothes. Imagine that's your job title, Your Majesty. Meanwhile, bedbugs were the silent killers of medieval sleep. They hid in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even cracks in stone walls, then popped out at night to feast like tiny little vampires. Ever wonder why medieval folks wore nightcaps and full clothes to bed? It wasn't always about staying warm. Sometimes it was bug armor. The solutions ranged from mild to seriously intense. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like mugwort or tansy to ward off insects. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes on the bed, probably useless against pests, but definitely a great way to kill any chance of romance. It wasn't just physical discomfort. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin or moral filth. a grim reminder of human downfall and a terrible choice for a bedmate. There are tons of poems written about fleas. Some are moralizing, others strangely romantic, because nothing says, I love you, like let's stick together, like fleas, biting both of us. So while modern sleep is interrupted by phone rings and streetlights, medieval sleep had a much higher chance of being disturbed by scratching, twitching, and that vague feeling of something crawling up your shin, because that's exactly what was happening. We all have sleepless nights, but have you ever tried sleeping while wearing 100 pounds of iron? No. In medieval times, some folks did exactly that, because nothing says sweet dreams like prepping for a joust while you nap. To be clear, most people, even knights, didn't usually sleep in full armor. It's hot, heavy, and noisy. Trying to roll over in full plate armor is like trying to sleep in a bag full of knives. But during wartime or in enemy territory, sleeping with part of your armor on was considered safer, comfortable, optional, survival approved. A campaign night might only require ditching the helmet and gloves, keeping your chainmail or breastplate on just in case the enemy throws a surprise midnight party. Nothing like waking up to hoofbeats and having to suit up while still half dreaming about turnips. In besieged castles, armed soldiers might even sleep with swords or axes nearby. Like some hardcore security blankets, the shield could double as a pillow, and if the enemy broke through the walls, at least you wouldn't be caught without your armor. Priorities? Of course, sleeping in armor wasn't exactly restorative. Iron isn't breathable, and chainmail tends to chafe the skin. Add cold stone floors, minimalist bedding, snoring buddies, and crackling torches, and you've got a sleep environment ranked just above an airport terminal for comfort. Even non-combatants sometimes wore light armor to bed in dangerous areas. Traveling merchants or guards might catch a nap in a gambeson, a thick padded jacket that offered some protection and more cushion than divine prayers alone. And don't forget, armor wasn't exactly subtle. If you rolled the wrong way, you'd make enough noise to wake the whole crew and convince them the apocalypse was upon them. In an age when nighttime demons, lice, and pigs in the bed were normal. You might think sleepwalking was just a medieval nuisance. Nope, it was way more dramatic than that. If you started wandering around in your sleep back then, people wouldn't blame stress or exhaustion. They'd say you were possessed, cursed, or had unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking or night roaming, if you wanted to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and mostly feared. The idea that someone could get up from their straw mattress, shuffle around the room, and stare at a wall wasn't seen as harmless insomnia, but more like a demon rehearsal dinner. Records from back then show people were genuinely terrified of sleepwalkers. Picture this: a man in a long nightshirt, holding a candle, eyes glazed over, mumbling Latin nonsense as he stumbles past livestock. You'd think ghost, heretic, or both. And depending on the local priest, the exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some folks back then thought sleepwalking was caused by a bad mood, especially too much black bile. Yeah, that was the medieval go-to explanation for pretty much anything they couldn't wrap their heads around. Others claimed it happened because the soul temporarily wandered free during sleep, letting the body roam like an unsupervised donkey. To stop these nighttime adventures, people tried everything: herbal meds, prayers in bed, hanging iron charms, or in the more rural spots, just tying the sleepwalker's feet to a chair. If that sounds extreme, consider medieval homes had open fireplaces, knives everywhere, and chamber pots just waiting for a tragic spill. In a weird twist, rumors said some people climbed onto roofs while asleep, whether these tales were blown out of proportion or not. The fear of sleepwalkers jumping off led to barred windows and theological debates about whether you could sin while unconscious. Luckily, most sleepwalkers just paced, mumbled, or tried to open imaginary doors. But if someone wandered into a church sleepwalking, locals might see it as a holy sign or call for a cleansing ritual just to cover up any spiritual fuss. If medieval life taught people anything, it's how to sleep through chaos church bells, storms, livestock screaming, and occasional sieges. For medieval denizen insomniacs, that was just background noise, the medieval version of white noise. Let's start with the bells. Church bells marked every sacred moment of the day dawn, prayer time, meals, and of course, the 2 or 3 prayer hour. If you lived near a monastery, your dreams got RSVP'd by the steady ringing. Eventually, your brain just gave in. The bells became the lullaby for an overworked soul, and it wasn't just the bells. Storms were frequent and terrifying. No weather apps or triple pane windows meant you got front row seats to every thunderclap like the world was ending. Leaky roofs, rattling windows, and howling chimneys that sounded like demons. Yet people still slept. They had to. Work didn't stop for insomnia, nor did plowing fields, praying, or running from Vikings. Speaking of which, invasions and apocalyptic events weren't always a big deal at bedtime. In the 14th century, people kept sleeping through famines, wars, and even the Black Death when funeral carts rolled by in the morning. It was more of a scary wake-up call than a panic trigger, and if you didn't wake up, some thought you were lucky. There are even records of people sleeping through earthquakes, fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was common, and bodies adapted. If you worked from dawn till dusk, barely ate enough to survive, and spent the day dodging mud, taxes, and spiritual curses, you'd sleep like a rock, and some people saw sleep as an escape, facing illness, grief, or the ever-predicted apocalypse which seemed to pop up every century. Some just curled up under their cloaks, muttered prayers, and took a nap. There's a weird kind of wisdom in that. In the winter of 1692, Salem, Massachusetts, wasn't just covered in snow. It was blanketed by tension, suspicion, and a quiet fear creeping into wooden houses and frozen fields. The Salem folks were Puritans, strict, religious, and extremely superstitious. They believed they were building a holy community in the wilderness, a city on a hill watched by God and stalked by Satan. Life was already hard. This village had split from Salem town over politics and religion. Crops failed. Smallpox ravaged neighboring communities. Wars with native tribes left many wounded. Bedtime was always a big deal. In the 14th century, people kept sleeping through famine, war, and even the Black Death. When corpse carts rolled by in the morning, it was more of a spooky wake-up call than a panic trigger. And if you didn't wake up, some folks thought it was lucky. There are even records of people sleeping through earthquakes, fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was common, and bodies adapted. If you worked from dawn till dusk, ate just enough to survive, and spent your days dodging mud, taxes, and spiritual curses. You slept like a rock, and some saw sleep as an escape, facing illness, grief, or the ever-predicted apocalypse like clockwork every century. Some just curled up under their cloaks, muttered prayers, and took a nap. There's a strange kind of wisdom in that. In the winter of 1692, Salem, Massachusetts wasn't just blanketed by snow. It was covered in tension, suspicion, and a quiet terror seeping into wooden houses and frozen fields. The Puritan townsfolk were strict, devout, and seriously superstitious. They believed they were building a holy community out in the wild, a godly hilltop city watched over by the big guy upstairs and stalked by Satan himself. Life was already a mess. This village had just split from Salem over politics and religion drama. Crops failed. Smallpox ravaged nearby communities. Wars with native tribes left many wounded. Neighbors were at each other's throats. Inheritance fights were common. And there was serious bitterness toward outsiders or anyone who didn't quite fit in. Add a long, bleak, brutal New England winter, and yeah, something was bound to snap. It all started at Pastor Samuel Parris's house. The village's own spiritual leader, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began acting weird, screaming nonstop, throwing things, twisting their bodies like they were possessed. Sometimes they'd just go silent for hours, eyes wide with terror. The neighbors whispered that they were cursed. The girls claimed invisible forces were pinching and biting them. Pastor Parris, clueless and desperate, called in a local doctor named William Griggs. After finding no physical cause, Griggs dropped a bombshell diagnosis that sent the whole village into chaos witches. Just that one word lit a fire under Salem's simmering fears. In a place where witches were believed to be the devil's dangerous sidekicks, that idea wasn't exactly outlandish. And if the devil could sneak into the pastor's house, what did that mean for the rest of the town? Pushed by adults and peers alike, the girls started naming names. First, they went after the outcast women, the ones who didn't fit in and were shunned, accusing the social outcasts, the women on the fringes, the rejects. But it didn't take long before the accusations reached respected, wealthy, even devout folks. Salem was small, but what was coming echoed far beyond its borders. What started as whispers in the dark soon became cries from the gallows and a legacy of paranoia that haunts American history books. As the idea of witchcraft took root in Salem, it spread like ivy, quiet at first, then strangling everything it touched. The tormented girls Betty, Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis only got bolder. They convulsed in court, screamed during prayers, and claimed to see dark spirits hovering over parts of the village. It wasn't just childish imagination, it was theatrical, public, and worst of all, believed. The first accused were the most vulnerable, women living on society's edge. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar known for mumbling to herself when kicked out of doorways. People thought her muttering was a curse. She smoked a pipe. She yelled at kids. She fit the witch stereotype perfectly because she didn't fit the Puritan mold. Sarah Osborne hadn't been to church in over a year and shook the community by marrying a servant after her first husband died. A woman who defied convention was automatically suspicious. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Pastor Parris's house, hailed from Barbados. Her storytelling, accent, and folk culture terrified the villagers. Under pressure, and maybe even a beating, Tituba confessed to being a witch. But instead of clearing things up, her confession blew the lid off the whole thing. She told tales of a tall man in black, a devil figure, demanding her to sign a book. She said she saw strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, even ghost dogs. But the worst part, she claimed there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed to hear. Once Tituba cracked, others rushed to follow suit. New names piled up weekly. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Old grudges disguised as righteous accusations. Property disputes morphed into witch attacks. If someone's cow suddenly died, well, obviously a witch did it. If livestock died during prayer, it was definitely the devil's work. Fear spread so fast even the innocent stayed silent. Defending an accused witch was basically signing your own death warrant. Fear got so bad that even the innocent kept quiet. Silence was safety, and so the web of accusations grew, trapping the village in sticky, invisible threads. Logic was fading fast. Panic was running the show, as accusations soared and the village hit a boiling point. The colonial government stepped in, speaking out. Defending an accused witch was basically signing your own social death warrant. Fear spread so fast even the innocent stayed quiet. Silence was safety, and so the web of accusations grew, trapping the village in a sticky, invisible snare. Logic took a back seat. Panic was driving the show, with accusations piling up and the village hitting meltdown mode. The colonial government stepped in. Newly appointed Governor William Phipps, eager to keep order, set up a special court to deal with the chaos. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, fancy French for hear and determine. But really, it was a fear-fueled justice factory. The court convened in Salem in June 1692, and it was anything but normal. Its rules were twisted by panic. Instead of needing solid evidence or reliable witnesses, it accepted something way scarier: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence meant testimony claiming the accused's ghost or spirit haunted the victim. In other words, if someone said they saw your spooky ghost self in a nightmare choking them, that was good enough for court. No need to check if you were actually at church or miles away. Your spirit did the devil's dirty work. You can't cross-examine a dream. And, worse, you can't disprove it either. Kids were the star witnesses. Their convulsions, screams, and gasps got more dramatic by the day. A girl named Mary Walcott would start shaking the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner looked at her, she'd scream. If they didn't, she'd scream louder. The performances were mesmerizing, and the judges, including the respected Samuel Sewall and Chief Justice William Stoughton, bought it all. No defense lawyers allowed. The concept didn't exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you were on your own. Deny the charges, and those poor girls suffered. Confess, and you might live, but only if you named others. This system rewarded snitching and punished silence. Even worse, the trials turned into a public circus. People from nearby towns came to watch. The accused were dragged into court, usually confused, broke, and utterly helpless, but not everyone bought the act. Some whispered the girls were faking it. Others wondered why only certain folks were targeted, but few dared speak up. Questioning the court meant questioning God's will. In Salem, reason was tossed aside, and the law became a mirror reflecting fear, not justice. On June 10th, 1692, the Salem gallows, claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was no stranger to scandal. Her reputation made her an easy target. Reason got tossed aside, and the law became a mirror reflecting fear, not justice. On June 10th, 1692, Salem's gallows claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She wasn't new to drama. Her reputation made her an easy target. She wore bright red, ran a tavern, and had been accused of witchcraft years earlier. During the trial, neighbors swore her ghost haunted them at night. Their kids died after she passed by, and she kept cursed dolls. She denied everything. Still, the court found her guilty. She was led to Gallows Hill, a bleak, windy spot just outside Salem. No prayers, no mercy. The noose was tightened. The crowd watched, and just like that, the death machine was set in motion. The hanging was quick. By July 19th, the 5 more women had been executed. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin. The hangings went fast. On July 19th, 5 more women met their fate. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some of them were pretty respected in church circles. Rebecca Nurse's case, in particular, was a shocker. An elderly, devout woman beloved by the community. Even the original jury declared her innocent, but under pressure from the court and the afflicted girls, the verdict was reversed. Her last words, whispered through the air like a warning, "I am as innocent as a newborn babe. Too bad that didn't matter." The noose doesn't discriminate. In August, more executions followed. September 22nd was the bloodiest day. 8 people hanged in just one morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman who doubted the whole ordeal from the start, and her husband, Jales Corey, who met a different kind of death. Jales refused to enter a plea. The court couldn't try him without one. So, they resorted to an old English punishment called peine forte et dure. They pressed him to death, stones piled, slowly on his chest for 3 days straight. Legend says his last words weighed way more than those stones. By the end of the madness, 19 were hanged, 1 was crushed to death, and at least 5 others died in jail awaiting trial. Dozens snitched just to save their skins. Over 200 accused. The gallows cast a long shadow, not just over Salem's Hill, but in every heart. Fear became law, and justice, blindfolded, marched straight to the scaffold. While the hangings grabbed headlines, hundreds more sat in cramped, stinky jails, waiting either for a verdict or a miracle. Salem's tiny jail simply couldn't hold them all. Accused witches were locked up in nearby towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to walls, starved, freezing, and, forgotten, most weren't witches or even outcasts. They were neighbors, friends, parents, kids guilty only of squabbling with the wrong person or owning land someone else wanted, in many cases. Accusations were thinly veiled personal vendettas dressed up as holy justice. A pig wandered into a neighbor's yard and died. Must be witchcraft. Someone refused to help carry firewood, obviously cursed. The axe, Mary East, sister to the executed nurse Rebecca, is a prime example. A respected mother of 7 and known for her piety. She was initially released by the court, only to be arrested days later when new fits broke out among the afflicted girls. The second arrest sealed her fate. In her final petition to the judges, Mary begged not for mercy, But for the case to end before more innocent blood was spilled, she was hanged shortly after. Another notable case, Dorothy Good, 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mom's arrest, Dorothy was interrogated and pressured to confess she was a witch. Her terrified, babbling responses were taken as gospel truth. She was shackled and imprisoned for 8 months. When finally freed, she was mentally broken and never recovered from the trauma. Pregnant women weren't spared either. Elizabeth Proctor, who would later be hanged alongside her husband, John Proctor, was convicted and sentenced to death. But since she was pregnant, her execution was delayed. That probably saved her life. She gave birth in jail and was eventually released. After the trials ended, accusations piled up faster than you can blink. Some defendants confessed in desperation to dodge death, then named others to shift suspicion away from themselves. Whole families got dragged into this mess. Fathers, wives, daughters, no one was safe. Meanwhile, jails overflowed, food ran out, disease spread. Some died waiting for trial, lost in legal madness, with new names added every week. Salem. Who you were didn't matter anymore. Just having someone willing to say your name was enough. By fall of 1692, the frenzy. In Salem, who you are doesn't matter anymore. You just need someone willing to say your name. By fall of 1692, the witch craze started to fade, not because the court got wise, but because reality forced a comeback. The turning point came when accusations got way too bold. Those who once backed the trials suddenly found themselves on the wrong side. Pastor George Burroughs, Salem's former preacher, was arrested and accused as the ringleader of the witch gang. He was educated, well-spoken, and had previously, he stood on the gallows and flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, something witches supposedly can't do. The crowd went silent. Some folks even cried. Even the seasoned spectators were shook. But the hanging went on anyway. That moment planted some serious doubt. Then came accusations from Mary Phipps, wife of Governor William Phipps. Suddenly, the frenzy spread to the colony's upper crust. Phipps, already stressed by growing backlash and chaos, finally stepped in. In October 1692, he disbanded the Oyer and Terminer Court, stopping all ongoing trials and executions. Public opinion shifted. Ministers who'd been silent or complicit started speaking out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, condemned spectral evidence. He said it was better to let 10 witches go free than to convict one innocent person. Pretty radical stuff in a society that believed the opposite for months. Those who cheered on the trials began to question them. Jails were still packed, but the thirst for blood had cooled off. Too many respected folks were accused. Too many innocents were buried. Villagers started realizing this wasn't God's justice. It was madness. Confessions dried up. Some accusers retracted their claims. Others vanished from public view, and those who'd screamed the loudest now looked down at the floor. Fear hadn't disappeared, but it ran out of steam. The public wanted stability. Officials wanted to save face, and Salem, bruised and embarrassed, was finally ready to wake up from this nightmare. The storm was coming, but the damage, it was already done. By the end of 1692, the justice system that fueled the frenzy began to crumble under the weight of its own absurdity. After Oyer and Terminer disbanded in October, a more cautious court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was set up in early 1693. This time, things were different. No more spooky evidence, and judges got way more skeptical about the accuser's wild claims. Verdicts slowed way down. Many accused witches got off. Out of 56 cases brought to the new court, most were freed. Even some who confessed started taking back their statements, blaming fear, torture, or pressure for their lies. The dramatic performances of the tormented girls lost their punch. The standout case during the trial wrap-up was that of Pastor Samuel Willard, a respected clergyman who got suspected, though never officially charged. The fact that such a high-ranking holy man could be eyed showed just how arbitrary and corrupt the whole thing had become. The once ferocious court grew cautious. They quietly started releasing those still in jail. First, the ones with weak evidence, then the ones who'd confessed under judges' orders. Meanwhile, families of the executed demanded justice. John Proctor's kids filed to get his property back. Rebecca Nurse's family launched a campaign to clear her name. Over time, shame replaced fear in the community. Church congregations split. Friendships broke. Salem's social order took a serious hit. Governor Phipps, sensing the colony's growing international embarrassment, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. But even freedom came with a price. Families had to pay jail fees before release. Imagine losing your home, health, and almost your life, only to get a bill for the privilege of surviving. By the end of the trials, 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 died in jail, and over 200 accused. The judge's orders. Meanwhile, families of the executed started demanding justice. John Proctor's kids filed to reclaim his property. Rebecca Nurse's family launched a campaign to clear her name. Over time, community shame replaced fear. Church congregations split. Friendships ended. Salem's social order was shattered. Governor Phipps, seeing the colony's growing international embarrassment, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. But freedom came at a cost. Many families had to pay jail fees before release. Imagine losing your home, health, and almost your life, only to get a bill for the privilege of surviving. The trials end. 19 were hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 died in jail, and over 200 accused. The court didn't just collapse, it exploded, leaving a deep pit of guilt, grief, and doubt. The trials ended, but the healing hadn't even started. Salem was a town forever, changed by lost souls, abandoned justice, and the mirror it now had to face. The gallows fell silent. The prison emptied. But Salem was far from peaceful. The gallows went silent. The jail emptied. But Salem, still nowhere near peaceful. The town wasn't haunted by ghosts. Nope. It was haunted by guilt. It all started with a few sick girls and exploded into a full-on community meltdown. Families torn apart, reputations shredded, and innocent lives snuffed out. Now the survivors are left with the wreckage. Neighbors can't even look each other in the eye. Folks who once prayed together are now testifying against one another. Some miserable girls quietly fled town. Others just vanished from public view. And some, like Ann Putnam Jr., later said sorry. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and publicly apologized for her role in the trials, blaming Satan's delusions. But for many, the damage was beyond words. The judges had to carry their share of the blame. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the big names from the trials, was one of the few to admit he messed up. In a rare public act of remorse, he stood in church in 1697 while a minister read his confession and prayer for forgiveness. a rare moment of owning up, in a time when most just wanted to forget. But forgetting, yeah, not that easy. Families of the condemned started demanding compensation for years. Petitions kept flooding Massachusetts officials, asking for official pardons, property returned, and public acknowledgement that the executed were innocent. The government dragged its feet. In 1711, the colony passed a law restoring rights and reputations to some victims and offered limited financial compensation to their heirs. But even that wasn't enough. Some families, like the Chorus and the Proctors, were totally left out. Witch rumors never left New England. But in Salem, shame became part of the town's identity to shake off its ugly past. The village eventually changed its name to Danvers. The Gallows Hill was never officially marked, like the town hoped to bury not just the dead, but the memory of what happened. But the memories stuck around in sermons, stories, and the awkward silence between old friends. Salem wasn't cursed by witches. It was cursed by fear, pride, and uncontrollable power, and that curse lingered long after the hangings ended. The Salem witch trials wrapped up over 3 centuries ago, but their legacy still echoes not just in textbooks and cheesy history tours, but in how we think about justice, fear, and the fragile nature of truth. What went down in 1692 wasn't just some weird group freakout. It was a total breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal integrity under panic. Ordinary folks, farmers, midwives, ministers all turned executioners just because they trusted too much and questioned too little. The court, supposed to protect the innocent, became a tool of oppression. Religion turned into a weapon, testimony became a show, and silence became guilt. One of the creepiest parts of the Salem tragedy was how fast it all went down in just a few months. Fear beat out truth. Old grudges disguised as spiritual warfare became death sentences. No devils or demons needed, just belief in them. But these trials also taught us some pricey lessons that spread through American society. In the centuries that followed, Salem kept popping up in debates about fair legal process and civil rights. The U.S. Constitution, written nearly a century later, flat out banned things like ex post facto laws and coercive measures that doomed Salem's accused. The rights to legal counsel, to face your accuser, and to require solid evidence all partly grew out of the ashes of Gallows Hill in modern times. The phrase, the rights to legal counsel, to face your accuser, and to demand concrete evidence are tough rules, partly forged from the ashes of Gallows Hill in modern times. The phrase, witch hunt, has become shorthand for political repression or moral panic, often tossed around without much thought to the real horror those words represent. But Salem isn't just a metaphor. It was a town where people were hanged for made-up crimes, betrayed by the very systems meant to protect them. Maybe the deepest lesson is, here's the thing, unchecked fear can turn into a dictatorship, and when that fear gets the official stamp from courts, churches, governments, it's basically unstoppable. The Salem witch trials aren't just a story about a village losing its mind, but a warning about how easily reason can collapse when fear gets the power. The gallows might be gone, courtrooms quieter, but the warning still loud and clear. Truth is fragile. Justice doesn't happen on its own, and history loves repeating itself unless we pay attention. Fulvia was born around 83 BC into the Fulvia family upper class, a bit quirky, a long-time commoner clan that climbed the Roman political ladder, not one of the oldest noble houses. But the Fulvii churned out plenty of advisors, generals, and fiery speakers. Their bloodline was equal parts ambition and a taste for shaking things up. Fulvia's dad, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was more famous for his awkward speeches than political legacy. His nickname Bambalio was a polite way of saying he stuttered, but Fulvia, no stuttering there. She was born to lead. From childhood, she was soaked in the harsh world of Roman power. Senators and generals argued policies at her house. Elections and betrayals were daily soap operas. She saw that politics wasn't just about speeches. It played out in marriages, funerals, gossip, and backroom deals. Women in Roman high society were expected to be quiet, classy, educated, and obedient. Fulvia, she smashed every one of those expectations, wealthy, educated, well-connected, and fully aware of it. Her childhood is a bit hazy in history books, but her later actions show she was sharp, politically savvy, and absolutely fearless. Not your average wallflower. She had a strong personality, sharp political mind, and the guts to act even in the male-dominated Roman political game. This was also a time of chaos. The Republic was falling apart. Civil wars, uprisings, and power grabs from guys like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar turned Rome into a pressure cooker. The old rules were crumbling, and Fulvia grew up right in the middle of the madness. Instead of backing down, she learned how to wield the chaos. Her childhood had no role model for the modest woman Rome idealized. Instead, she became a woman who saw politics not as some scary men's club, but as a battlefield waiting to be conquered. She went on to marry 3 powerful men, each a revolutionary figure in Roman history. But Fulvia didn't just marry power. She commanded armies, led rebellions, and became the first Roman woman to appear on coins, not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was ready for Rome. Her first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and let's just say, it was anything but traditional. Clodius wasn't your average Roman noble. He was a populist firebrand, a political arsonist with a hobby for chaos, scandals, and street power. To Rome's elite, he was dangerous. To the masses, a hero, and to Fulvia, a strategic opportunity. They tied the knot in the early 50s BC, reuniting Fulvia with the man who turned the Roman Republic into his personal stage. Clodius was famous for flouting tradition like a rebellious actor. He once dressed as a woman to sneak into a women-only religious ceremony at Caesar's house. Scandal only boosted his fame. Then he gave up his noble rank to run for tribune, a role that let him veto the Senate. Clodius knew Roman street politics better than most, and Fulvia wasn't a passive wife. She was right there with him. Not a silent shadow. Roman sources say Fulvia was crashing a ladies-only religious ceremony at Caesar's house. His scandalous antics only seemed to boost his fame. Then he gave up his noble status to run for the people's tribune, a position that let him veto the Senate. Clodius knew Roman street politics better than most, and Fulvia wasn't some passive wife tagging along. She was no silent sidekick. Roman sources say Fulvia was deeply involved in her husband's political world. She mingled with his supporters, showed up on his campaign trail and ran the household as Clodius's political HQ. Together, they were Rome's new power couple, bold, populist, and not shy about stirring the pot. But this alliance came with a price. In 52 BCE, Clodius was assassinated on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. In 52 BC, Clodius was assassinated on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death shook Rome to its core, but Fulvia wasn't about to cry quietly in the corner. She threw a political funeral that historians still talk about today. She paraded Clodius's mutilated corpse through the Roman Forum, flaunting his bloody wounds. For maximum shock value, the public was horrified and furious. Riots exploded. The Senate building went up in flames. Fulvia turned her personal grief into a full-blown public uprising. This was her first major political move, and it worked. Her talent for manipulating public emotions, using spectacle as a strategy, and weaponizing her husband's legacy made her a new kind of player in Roman politics. Clodius was dead, but Fulvius stepped out of the shadows, and Rome would never see her the same way again. She left behind no sorrow, because in Rome, political power usually has an expiration date, and she understood that better than anyone right after Clodius Pulcher's sudden death. She jumped into a second marriage, this time with Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's biggest fans. On the surface, Curio didn't exactly look like a heavyweight. He was known for being flashy and theatrical, but behind the glitz was a sharp political mind. As tribune of the people in 50 BC, Curio wielded serious influence during one of Rome's most unstable periods. The Republic was swinging between war and peace, Caesar's ambitions versus Senate resistance. Fulvia saw in Curio more than a husband. He was her ticket to the next power block. This wasn't a love comeback. It was a calculated alliance. After Clodius died, Fulvia needed a new political leader, someone who could carry on her first husband's populist legacy, and someone backed by Caesar. Curio fit the bill, thanks to him. Fulvia stayed glued to Rome's ever-shifting power game. She didn't just join the movement, she helped shape it. Fulvia kept Clodius's supporters active, refocused their goals under Curio's leadership, and maintained the urban masses' political engagement. But the Roman world was collapsing fast. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey exploded into civil war. Curio jumped into the fray, backing Caesar. Fulvia, as usual, stayed in the political trenches. She's said to have helped organize support and manage resources for her husband's campaign. In 49 BC, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to defend Caesar's position, but it was a disaster. He was ambushed and killed by King Juba of Numidia's forces. His death was brutal, and his army was wiped out. Once again, Fulvia became a widow, and once again, Rome wondered if she'd fade into the background. She didn't. Curio's death only cemented her reputation as a dangerously resilient political widow. She lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil chaos, both dying for populist ideals. But Fulvia wasn't done yet. Her boldest partnership and most dramatic chapter were still ahead. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and loyal ally of Julius Caesar. They got hitched around 47 BC. This was more than a romantic hookup. It was a power merger. Fulvia proved herself a master of street politics in Rome. Antony's rapid rise in military and political ranks needed savvy support like hers in Rome. Together, they became one of the most politically powerful couples of the Republic by the time they married. Fulvia was no stranger to blood and betrayal. She'd buried 2 husbands and crushed countless enemies. Antony, forming one of the most politically powerful duos of the Republic by the time they married. Fulvia was no stranger to blood and betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and crushed countless enemies. Antony wasn't exactly a saint either. He drank, gambled, and his private life was a total mess. But with Fulvia, he found someone who did more than just entertain him. She could protect his interests, keep his alliances intact, and rally supporters when he campaigned. And Antony, despite his brash image, knew her worth. Let Fulvia hold power no Roman woman had ever wielded in public before. She opened his letters, called the shots when he was away, showed up at meetings, and influenced appointments. The mostly hostile Roman sources painted her as bossy and power-hungry, but what really freaked them out wasn't her ambition. The problem was, she acted like a Roman man in a world that had 0 words for a woman like that. After Caesar's assassination, 44 BC, the Republic plunged back into chaos. Antony scrambled to secure his spot as Caesar's political heir, but Fulvia was the one holding Rome's reins, while Antony formed the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus. Fulvia played his proxy in the capital, managing patronage networks, coordinating street gangs, and making sure Antony's supporters were always mobilized. She even helped arrange the official peace between Antony and Octavian by marrying her daughter Claudia off to him, an alliance that didn't last long in public. Fulvia wasn't just Antony's wife, she was his stand-in. Roman coins were minted with Antony's face and name, an unprecedented nod to her status. She didn't hide in the shadows of power. She basked in its blinding spotlight, but power in Rome was always borrowed power, and Fulvia was about to test just how far a woman could push it before Rome pushed back. While Mark Antony chased military campaigns and political deals across the Roman world, Fulvia was the one controlling Rome's streets. She wasn't just his wife. She was his regent in every sense but the title, in a time when violence, bribery, and brute force kept order. Fulvia proved she could play the game better than, well, any man in the Senate, Rome. After Caesar's murder was a swordless battlefield, power became a moving target. Fulvia got that, and she solidified Antony's grip on the capital by becoming his political stand-in. She directed allies, dealt with urban mobs, negotiated factions, and boldly launched wars of words and coin. She funded loyal armies, bribed to keep public order, and made sure any law passed suited Antony's future. Some ancient sources, especially the hostile ones like Appian and Dio Cassius, call Fulvia cunning, sharp-tongued, even warlike. But beneath the sexist hype was a woman actively involved in politics in a world with no rulebook for women beyond weaving and wailing. Fulvia built alliances, backed military commanders, and even issued decrees tasks usually reserved for senators and advisors. She appeared in public and kept close ties with veteran soldiers, a politically crucial demographic in the final republic's power struggles. while Antony campaigned eastward. Fulvia was often the face of his power in Italy, meeting commanders, influencing land distribution, and reminding troops their loyalty to Antony would be rewarded. But this power grab came at a cost. The Roman elite, especially those allied with Octavian Caesar's heir and Antony's rising rival, were furious about Fulvia's influence. They saw her as a meddlesome woman with way too much power over legions, laws, and loyalties. Her ability to act without male supervision wasn't just threatening, it was unheard of. Fulvia wasn't naive. She knew the tension between Antony and Octavian was boiling over. She saw their alliance cracking and understood something both men seemed clueless about. The Republic wasn't big enough for the two of them, so Fulvia started prepping for the next phase. Not diplomacy, confrontation. She'd supported power long enough, sensing the tension between Antony and Octavian was boiling over. She saw their alliance cracking and understood something neither man seemed to fully get. The Republic wasn't big enough for both of them, so Fulvia started prepping for the next phase. Not diplomacy, but confrontation. She'd played the power game long enough. Now, she was ready to take charge herself. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus, and she didn't do it quietly. While her husband, Mark Antony, was camped out east, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother and a consul, decided to throw down the gauntlet against Octavian's power in Italy. Why, on the surface, it was about protecting Antony's interests and the land rights of his loyal Roman veterans. But underneath it all, Fulvia's fingerprints are everywhere. This wasn't just politics. This was a military rebellion led by a Roman woman. The first and only time in Roman history a woman actively stirred up and organized a civil war. The conflict, known as the Perusian War, exploded over Octavian's controversial land redistribution plan, which forced many Italians off their land to reward his soldiers. Fulvia seized on the growing resentment, painting Octavian as a tyrant and a traitor to Caesar's legacy, with Lucius acting as the Senate's figurehead and Fulvia pulling the strings. They raised 8 legions and took over the city of Perugia, modern-day Perugia. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources suggest she was way more invested in this conflict than Lucius. She rallied troops, stirred up the crowds, and even exchanged letters with generals. Rome buzzed with rumors that she was commanding legions, issuing orders, and pushing Lucius into battles he didn't want to fight. Octavian, though caught off guard, acted fast. He laid siege to Perugia throughout the winter of 41 BC, cutting off supplies and forcing the city to surrender. Fulvia, stuck between starvation and political betrayal, watched her bold gamble crumble. By early 40 BC. The city had fallen. Lucius Antonius was spared, probably to keep Antony at arm's length, but Fulvia was exiled, the woman who once commanded riots, marriages, armies, and public opinion was now deemed too dangerous for Rome. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, hoping to reunite with Antony, but Antony didn't come running. The once solid alliance between husband and wife had been eroded by the fog of war and distance. Fulvia acted in his name, but probably without his blessing. She dared what no Roman woman dared before start a civil war, and now the Republic made her pay. Exiled from Rome, Fulvia headed to Sicyon, a Greek city that had become a diplomatic purgatory for fallen power players. She fought not for herself, but for her husband. She believed she was defending Mark Antony's interests, honor, and maybe their shared vision for Rome. But what awaited her in exile wasn't a hero's welcome. It was silence. Fulvia gambled everything, her status, her alliances, her life. But Antony didn't rush to her side. In fact, when Fulvius arrived in Greece, Antony was tangled up with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romance was just starting or already brewing, the symbolism was brutal. While Fulvia gathered legions, Antony was raising glasses at parties with the queen. This betrayal stung deeply, not just personally, but politically. Fulvia fought to protect Antony's power in Italy, and in return, he left her behind. Some ancient historians, especially Plutarch, say Antony was furious at her for launching the Perusine War without his direct approval. Others think he welcomed her downfall. Either way, it cleared the path for a political marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would never have accepted. Still, Fulvia wasn't entirely without support. Some of Antony's soldiers, fiercely loyal to her, pushed for reconciliation, but her health began to fail. After enduring siege, exile, and betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BC, possibly from illness, stress, heartbreak, or all three. She was about 43. Her death gave Antony a clean political slate. Soon after, he met with Octavian and agreed to marry Octavia, Octavian's sister, as part of it. Waged the Perusine War without his direct approval. Some say Antony actually welcomed her downfall. This paved the way for a political marriage alliance with Octavian, which Fulvia would never accept, yet. She wasn't entirely without supporters. Some of Antony's soldiers, fiercely loyal to her, pushed for reconciliation, but her health began to fail after enduring siege, exile, and betrayal. Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE, likely from illness, stress, heartbreak, or all three. She was around 43. Her death gave Antony a clean political slate. Soon after, he met with Octavian and agreed to marry Octavia, Octavian's sister, as part of a new peace treaty. The trio temporarily united, but only because Fulvia, the only woman bold enough to challenge their scheming, was gone. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, who was basically the myth everyone knew about Roman women back then. But don't get it twisted, Fulvia was the original. She wasn't some power behind the scenes type. Nope. She marched right in, center stage, commanding armies in a world that treated women like furniture. Rome had no clue what to do with her, so they erased her, but the echoes of her rebellion stuck around, and her story is anything but ordinary. After Fulvia died in 40 BC, the people she once rallied, Antony, Octavian, and even her old allies, quietly started rewriting her legacy. She couldn't defend herself, so her story got shaped by her enemies and the awkward survivors left over from her ambitions. Like many powerful women in history, Fulvia ended up the scapegoat. The ancient sources, mostly penned by people with something to gain, painted her as the cause of the Perusine War, the split between Antony and Octavian, and basically the Republic's chaos. Ion, Dio Cassius, and Plutarch all described her as bossy, jealous, and power-hungry. They blamed her for dragging Lucius Antonius into the mess, stirring up beef with Octavian, and even Antony's eventual falling out with Rome. But were these accusations fair harsh? Yes. Fulvia played politics in a world where violence and backstabbing were just the daily grind if you were a guy. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more ruthless than Pompey, and definitely not worse than Octavian later on. The real difference. She was a woman is acting like a Roman man, and Rome didn't know how to handle that. She wasn't hiding behind curtains, quietly weaving or just looking pretty for politics. She wrote to generals, organized street mobs, and commanded army loyalty. And that made her dangerous, not just to Octavian, but to history itself. Even Mark Antony, the guy she fought to protect, blamed her for the Civil War after making peace with Octavian and marrying his sister. Antony used Fulvia's death as a diplomatic reset button. Her memory became the political price he paid to survive. No statues, no grand funerals, no Senate speeches, just silence. But her enemies couldn't erase her completely. Fulvia did too much. She raised armies, ran elections, brokered alliances, and kicked off a civil war. She was the first Roman woman to have her name on coins, not as a goddess or symbol, but as a political player. Smearing her was deliberate, but so was keeping her in the history books, despite all efforts to caricature and slander her. Fulvia refused to vanish. Her defiance still echoes. Just listen to those men. Fulvia's story ended in silence, but her legacy sure didn't. For centuries after her death, historians and writers struggled to fit her into Rome's grand narrative because she broke every rule about what a Roman woman was supposed to be. She wasn't just a shadow power holder, she was the power holder, making her unforgettable and terrifying to a patriarchal world. In a society where women were expected to influence through whispers and marriages. Fulvia shouted through politics, war, and the public stage. She wasn't a side piece. She was a commander, yet. She's remembered more for her defiance than for her achievements. Roman historians couldn't stomach a woman who wouldn't stay in her lane, so they rewrote her as loud, power-hungry, and troublemaking. But if you read between the lines, you find a different woman. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to put her name on coins. She wasn't just the shadowy power behind the throne, she became the power itself, and that made her unforgettable and seriously scary, especially in a world run by old-school patriarchy, in a society where women were supposed to influence things quietly through whispers and marriages. Fulvia basically yelled from the rooftops with politics, war, and center stage drama. She wasn't some side chick. She was a commander, yet. History remembers her more for her rebellious streak than her actual achievements. Roman historians couldn't stand a woman who stepped out of line, so they painted her as loud, power-hungry, and troublemaking. But if you read between the lines, there's a different story. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to mint coins with her own name on them. She organized political factions, weaponized marriage like a pro, and pulled the strings of Roman street politics with jaw-dropping skill. She survived the 1st century BCE civil wars not as a bystander, but as a player, a woman whose influence terrified senators and shaped the fate of the triumvirate. Her downfall wasn't about incompetence. It was about timing and gender. If she'd been born a man, she'd probably be a legend today. She might have gone down in history as a second Caesar or a way sexier Cato. Instead, she got cast as the wicked woman who dared to do way too much. Still, her legacy quietly sticks around. Later, Roman women like Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra, though from a different world, all operated under the shadow Fulvia helped cast. They'd manipulate emperors, command armies, and control succession, but Fulvia did it first, without any royal title to shield her. Today, modern historians are giving her a fresh look. No longer just a cautionary tale, she's now recognized as one of the most politically active women in Roman history, a woman who pushed the limits of female power and paid dearly for it. She didn't just live in the age of the triumvirate, she challenged it, and while Rome may have tried to erase her, Fulvia left her mark everywhere. In its collapse, she wasn't a footnote, she was a force, a woman way ahead of her time by centuries. By summer 1963, the U.S. was teetering between two worlds, one rooted in centuries of oppression, the other craving freedom. Down south, racism wasn't just social norm, it was law. Black Americans couldn't enter restaurants, schools, buses, polling places, or even water fountains. Police brutality was everywhere. Lynchings still happened in places like Birmingham, Alabama. Peaceful protesters faced attack dogs and fire hoses. But change was coming, and it wasn't asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement grabbed the nation's attention. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts became headline material. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just names, they were symbols of defiance. The March on Washington wasn't born from one chat. It was the boiling point of growing frustration and fierce hope. Black Americans were done waiting. They demanded civil rights and were determined to be heard. At the nation's most important stage, its capital, the idea of a massive Washington March had been around for decades. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, proposed it back in the 1940s. Back then, the goal was to pressure Roosevelt to end racial discrimination in defense industries. That protest got scrapped after Roosevelt bowed and signed an executive order, but by 1963 the stakes were higher. Randolph, along with other civil rights leaders like Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision, and this time they weren't just marching for jobs. They marched for dignity, voting rights, desegregation of schools, equal pay, and, most importantly, the basic human right to live without fear. Over a dozen major civil rights groups came together despite disagreements because they knew the power of a united front. The countdown had begun. Buses were lined up. Flyers spread like wildfire. Word of mouth traveled faster than the press, and all across the country, Black Americans were gearing up for one of the most unforgettable moments in U.S. history. The dream was taking shape, step by step. Organizing any protest in Washington, D.C. wasn't a walk in the park, but planning for over 100,000 people, maybe more, was downright crazy. Logistically, it sounded like a nightmare. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, bathrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control, safety plans. Somehow, they pulled it off. At the center of this controlled chaos, permits, crowd control, safety plans. Somehow, they pulled it off. Right in the middle of this chaos with a plan stood Bayard Rustin, openly gay, usually keeping to the shadows for political reasons, but a master strategist nonetheless. Rustin had studied direct nonviolence under Gandhi's followers in India. He was that of a seasoned strategist. Rustin studied direct nonviolence under Gandhi's followers in India. He marched, got jailed, beaten, and watched by the FBI, but nothing shook him. He saw the fight as marching to Washington was the perfect chance to show the world that a disciplined, nonviolent protest could actually get things done if you organize it right, with military precision. No less, in just 8 weeks, Rustin and his crew turned the idea from a pipe dream into reality. The official name, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, because they wanted to sound serious and intentional, became the spiritual icon of the era. Randolph and Rustin made sure the demands weren't just about unemployment, minimum wage, and workers' rights, but also civil rights. Meanwhile, tension simmered beneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were seriously worried. They feared riots, backlash, or worse, bloodshed. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful. Still, the National Guard was on standby. Washington, D.C. hospitals were on alert, and alcohol sales were banned for the day. Federal workers were even told they could stay home. Then there was the whole unity issue. 6 major civil rights groups, NAACP, CPS, SNCC, SCLC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, were often at odds over tactics. Some wanted a more aggressive approach, others preferred diplomacy. The younger SNCC folks were getting impatient with King's nonviolent style, but everyone agreed on one thing: the time for silence was over. Rustin's plan was basically a military campaign. Every bus and train was tracked. Every speaker was timed down to the minute. Every route had police trained in crowd control. They weren't just organizing a march. They were staging a moment that could shake the nation's conscience. August 28th, 1963, a sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C., by 9 a.m. The sun was blazing and the humidity was like a second skin, but no one cared. People came from all over the country, black, white, young, old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best. Others clutched protest signs like life rafts. They arrived by bus, train, carpools, even on foot. Over 250,000 in total flooded the National Mall like a rising wave of hope. And yet, no chaos. Despite the government's fears of riots and unrest, the scene was eerily calm. Volunteers directed traffic. The Red Cross handed out water. Choirs sang freedom songs. Folks held hands and cheered as new marchers arrived. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool and hymns about work and freedom echoing off the marble pillars of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities joined in Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one was there to collect autographs. They came to witness history and speak up for a cause bigger than any one person. The crowd was orderly but buzzing with energy. No pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, everyone understood this wasn't just a protest. It was a sacred moment. For many black Americans, just standing in the mall was a quiet revolution to be seen, to be counted, to say, "We are here, right in front of the Lincoln Memorial, where the great liberator sits in stone." It was a full circle moment for generations. At exactly noon, the program officially kicked off. Leaders took the stage one by one, each representing different groups, ideologies, and regions, but united by the message. Speakers demanded equal pay, an end to school segregation, a living wage, and a stop to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang Marian Anderson, who was once banned from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, near the reflecting pool, with hymns about work and freedom echoing off the marble pillars of the Lincoln Memorial. Famous folks showed up too: Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one was there to collect autographs. They came to witness history and speak up for a cause bigger than any of them. The crowd was orderly but buzzing with energy. No shoving, no looting, no violence. Instead, everyone got that this wasn't just a protest. It was a sacred moment for many Black Americans. Just standing in the mall felt like a quiet revolution to be seen, to be counted, to say, we're here right in front of the Lincoln Memorial, where the great emancipator sat carved in stone. It was the full circle moment of generations. At exactly noon, the official program kicked off. Leaders stepped onto the stage one by one, each representing different groups, ideologies, and regions, but all united in their message. The speakers demanded equal pay, an end to school segregation, living wages, and a stop to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang Marian Anderson, once banned from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands under the open sky. As time passed, tension grew not from anxiety, but from anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for hadn't spoken yet, and when he did, the whole world would stop, listen, and remember the march didn't just make history. It was slowly turning into legend, minute by minute, by mid-afternoon. The crowd was silent, not because they were tired, but because they knew what was coming next. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. stepped up to the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neat tie, and looked calm, though you could tell there was a fire burning inside him. He'd prepped his speech the night before, typing and writing it with his advisors, but what the world remembers wasn't what was typed out. It was what came straight from his heart. He started steady, laying out the brutal facts of racism, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he said, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation. The Negro still is not free. His voice rose and fell like a sermon. He used repetition, rhythm, and silence not as filler, but like musical notes. The crowd hung on every word, some nodding, some wiping tears, others holding signs that just said now. But what happened next changed everything. The tears, the signs, yeah, all of it. What came next flipped the whole event, and arguably the whole civil rights movement's course. Right behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. Suddenly, she shouted, "Tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream," and King did just that. He set his notes aside, gripped the podium tight, and launched into a passage he'd read before, but never like this. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each word grew louder, clearer. More determined, I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will sit together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It stopped being a speech. It became a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history when King closed with, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The crowd erupted applause, tears, cheers. They knew they weren't just hearing words, they were hearing a prophecy. The power of the March on Washington wasn't just in the speeches or the music, it was in the people. The sheer scale of humanity gathered that day was staggering. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, everywhere. Some were seasoned activists who'd marched dozens of times. Others had never left home until now. They packed lunches, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept in their church clothes just to be there. Many were everyday folks' maids, teachers, steelworkers, postal workers, not politicians, but witnesses. They didn't just want change, they were the change. The crowd included kids, young black girls with ribbons in their hair, boys holding handmade signs, parents hoisted toddlers on their shoulders so they could see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance and hear the speaker's voice through the loudspeakers. For them, this was more than an event. It was the start of a new world. Some standout faces: a young guy named John Lewis, just 23, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. His original speech was so fiery and intense that the top leaders asked him to tone it down just a bit before going on stage. He agreed, just barely. His call for radical change still shook the crowd, could see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance, and hear the speaker's voice booming over the loudspeakers. For them, this wasn't just an event. It was the dawn of a new world. Some familiar faces were there. A young guy named John Lewis, just 23, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His opening speech was so fiery and intense that the top brass begged him to tone it down just a few minutes before he hit the stage. He agreed, but barely. His radical call for change still shook the crowd. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, not as herself, but reading a pre-written statement, standing up for other women fighting for civil rights. The organizers got hit with criticism for silencing women's voices. Bates's short but punchy message laid down a harsh truth, even in a movement about equality. Some voices still struggle to get heard. Also, there were union organizers, Jewish clergy, nuns, priests, and students from all walks of life. Not everyone agreed on tactics. Some backed King's nonviolent approach. Others leaned towards. But on that day, those differences didn't matter. Unity took the spotlight. It was a visual symphony of America's potential. Black and white hands locked tight in solidarity. Freedom. Now badges pinned proudly on shirts, and the sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one. Faces in the crowd weren't just watching history, they were shaping it, and none of them could ever forget what they saw. While the world witnessed unity, inspiration, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, behind the scenes, the March on Washington was no walk in the park. What seemed like a perfectly synchronized movement was actually held together by grit, sweat, and a ton of last-minute compromises. Bayard Rustin, the march's chief architect, fought battles, not just in logistics, but also politics. He was constantly under scrutiny, not only because he was openly gay and a former communist, but also because some civil rights leaders worried his identity might be used to discredit the whole movement. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell once threatened to out Rustin and Dr. King as lovers if things didn't go his way. King didn't kick Rustin out of a previous campaign. That threat hung over every planning meeting. Then there was the whole women's voices issue. Despite key roles by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, no woman got a solo spotlight speech. Rosa Parks was there, respected by all, but she never got the mic. Behind the shiny surface of the march was the truth. The movement was still wrestling with its own hierarchy and blind spots, even among the 6 big organizations. Tensions flared up. SNCC leaders grew frustrated with the slow pace and the older generation's stubborn push for moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism head on. CORE felt the same frustrations, but unity was supposed to last just for the day. Meanwhile, the feds were watching with clenched teeth. Edgar Hoover's FBI sent over 100 agents to tail the organizers. They bugged hotel rooms, tailed key players, and built dossiers. They were sure the march would either turn violent or get hijacked by communists. When nothing happened, they just doubled down on surveillance, especially on Dr. King. And don't forget the money. The march burned through over $250,000. That's millions today. Most came from unions and sympathetic donors. But the organizers scrambled until the last minute. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, sure, but it was also messy, imperfect, chaotic, political, and unfinished, just like the country. It was trying to heal. The sun slowly set behind the Washington Monument as the crowd started to thin. People hugged, cried, sang, and lingered as long as they could, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the march was over. Speeches read, banners raised. The whole world watched. And now, that heavy question hung in the damp August air. What happens next? In the days after, media reactions were cautious but positive. Big newspapers acknowledged the event's historic nature, usually with a curious, neutral tone. Some called it an orderly, solemn march, implying no riots broke out. Few outlets spent much time on the march's specific demands, like a call for a federal jobs program or a $20 minimum wage in today's dollars. But everyone tracked Dr. King's speech. At least that couldn't be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who initially disliked the idea of the march, watched it on TV with growing admiration and maybe surprise. He called it impressive and met civil rights leaders at the White House soon after. But legislative progress stayed sluggish. His civil rights bill stalled in Congress, stuck on Southern opposition riders. Some activists were disappointed. They'd hoped the march would spark immediate action. Instead, it slid back into the usual grind, organizing, marching, protesting, and mourning those who paid the price for justice. Just weeks later, reality hit hard. On September 15th of 1963, 4 black girls died in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The dream had been spoken, yes, but the nightmare wasn't over. Still, something had changed. The March on Washington marked a new chapter in the Civil Rights Movement. It proved mass protests could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It brought together a bigger coalition than ever labor unions, religious leaders, celebrities, students, and working class folks. The nightmare wasn't over yet, but something changed. The March on Washington marked a new chapter in the Civil Rights Movement. It proved mass protests could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It brought together a broader coalition than ever labor unions, religious leaders, celebrities, students, and working class Americans, all in one place, united for justice, and above all, it gave the movement a voice, a dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed worldwide. The march ended, but the road was just beginning, and that road would soon lead to blood, laws, and transformation. The March on Washington didn't just shake America's conscience, it reshaped the moral landscape, starting as a bold act of protest. The march, forever changing how Americans see justice, democracy, and the power of collective action, legally. The march didn't score instant wins, but it kicked things into gear less than a year later. In July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. This law banned discrimination in public places and outlawed bias in hiring based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, hitting the core of the movement and ending Jim Crow laws. Would those bills have passed without the march? Maybe, but would they have packed the same moral punch and unstoppable public pressure? Probably not. For Martin Luther King Jr., that day's speech launched him into a whole new world. He went from respected leader to global icon, but fame came with a price: constant surveillance, threats, and eventually his assassination in 1968. The dream he spoke of on those steps only grew deeper, more tragic, and more revered over the years for the broader movement. The march showed what unity could accomplish. It gave organizers a template for mass mobilization and inspired a generation of activists both in the U.S. and abroad. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders worldwide look to the March on Washington as their model. But the legacy isn't just history, the language of the march, the ideas of work and freedom, the image of peaceful protest, and the echo of "I have a dream" still resonate in today's protests. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter, the spirit of '63 lingers in every chant and cardboard sign in Washington, D.C. Dr. King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin, facing the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors pass by, his towering statue, carved in granite with lines from that August day. But the real memorial isn't in stone. It lives in classrooms, voting booths, marches, and voices that refuse to be silenced because the dream wasn't meant to stay in history books. It's meant to live on, and the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to keep it alive. More than 60 years have passed since that summer day when over 250,000 people stood, shoulder to shoulder, under the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools. His voice, steady and strong, echoes through the national memory like a sacred chorus. But for many, the question remains, has the dream come true or just been delayed in some ways? Progress is undeniable. The legal framework of racial segregation has been wiped out. Voting rights, though currently under attack in many states, were won through blood, marches, and court battles. The presence of black legislators, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president was unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once illegal in much of the country, is now protected by federal law. These aren't small things. They're victories born from relentless struggle. Still, the march's original demands, often overshadowed by King's speech, continue to echo unresolved. The call for a living wage remains. Unmet racial gaps in education, housing, jobs, and healthcare still persist. Police brutality, the very spark for much of the early civil rights movement, keeps fueling outrage and protest. Police brutality, the spark that lit most early civil rights movements, kept fueling outrage and protest. The dream of true economic justice in a country where opportunity isn't predetermined by zip code or skin color still felt distant. Modern movements, like Black Lives Matter, have carried the torch, often using the imagery and language of the '63 march as both inspiration and indictment. They march through the same cities, shout slogans down the same streets, and demand basic human rights. But they do it in a world transformed by social media, surveillance, and brand new forms of protest. The March on Washington was never seen as the finish line. It's a flashpoint, a marker on the ground saying, this is who we are, and this is what we want. It's a statement, not a final verdict. So the dream keeps getting stomped on, challenged, reinterpreted, but it's still alive, whether it's delayed, distorted, or someday actually comes true. Doesn't hinge on the past, but on us, the choices we make, the injustices we face, and the guts we muster to keep pushing until the dream becomes a shared reality.